Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about niches. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, I want to specialize instead of being a full stack developer. What are some niches I should look at? Well, I would say that the obvious ones are going to be front end, back end, and DevOps. Those would be the best choices, I would suppose. Um, let's talk a little bit about the different roles and kind of what they entail and some pros and cons, just some basic ones. There's so much more to it, but I'll give you just like a simple rundown of the whole thing. So basically what I'm saying to you is that the average developer is not a full stack developer. It requires an enormous amount of skill and investment to become a really good full stack developer. Most full stack developers are back end or front end heavy and kind of can do the other thing, but the ones that are really, really good are usually really, really, really good, and they work really hard to get there. However, if that's not for you, if you don't want to be wide and like know the entire stack, it's perfectly fine for you to just focus on one or the other. So let's talk about the front end first and foremost. So front end development is a up and coming. It's a fairly well, at this point, I mean, it is established. It's just that it's not as widespread as you might think. I mean, the backend developers are the ones who have been around for the longest of the front end and backend roles, but the space in front end is now very rapidly growing, and more people are hiring front end developers. The thing that is nice about front end is that I don't think that there is a nicer experience in terms of learning and getting into how to do things, because there's so much content that is related to front-end tooling. A lot of the hype in IT and web these days is revolving around the front-end space and the JavaScript community and so forth. Now, so if you're going to go into anything and you want a kind of a light introduction, then the front-end space will be the best thing for you. The one thing I should warn you about, though, is that in order for you to be a good front-end developer, you're going to have to work quite a bit, because there's quite a lot of tooling in front-end in comparison to in back-end. We're going to talk about back-end as well, but on average there's quite a lot of chaos. There's quite a lot of options in front-end, and it can feel a little bit overwhelming to learn all the things that are related to front-end work. And another thing that is worth knowing is that the front-end developer is usually, well, if you only focus on the front-end development stuff, it's very unlikely that you will learn how to work with serious systems. I'm not saying that you're not going to learn skills that are valuable. I'm just saying that you're not going to become a real software developer on average. It's going to, or at the very least, you're going to have to go beyond what a front-end developer in most cases is going to be exposed to when they're in their learning stages. I will go as far as to say that the best front-end developers that I know are full-stack developers, because most front-end developers they 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 learn the tooling that is related to front end, but they don't really learn how to write software, if that makes sense. They learn tools instead of practices, and that's where the back end developers are a little bit ahead of the curve. They're more engineers or engineer heavy tech wise than the front end developers, but the work of a front end developer is still very much in demand. Thing to know though is that it can, as I said, be a little bit tricky for you to figure out how to get employed and how to do all these sorts of things right, because there's so many options, and it can be very hard for you to create a good learning roadmap for yourself. So let's talk about the backend developers. This is probably the easiest and most low-hanging fruit thing to do if you want to have stable work and you want to have and you want to avoid being a full stack developer. So the backend developers is, well, they are the bread and butter of the entire industry. They are most of, like, they make up the bulk of the entire industry, I would say. And if you're interested in working with APIs on a server, doing the normal sort of stuff that you would expect from a web developer, which is persisting things to a database and so forth, and dealing with business logic, etc., then this is definitely the space for you. What's nice about going into backend development is that it's probably the most mainstream thing you can do. You can transition from a backend developer to a front-end developer or a DevOps person and so forth. That transition is usually very easy, and because you get even though it might be a little bit harder for you to learn backend development than it might be to learn full front-end development, at least in the earlier stages, because it's a little bit more technical, it is probably the best starting point, if that makes sense. It is if you can master backend development, you have a very good foundation to learn anything else if you do decide in the future to actually branch out and become something more. Because even though you might today feel like, because I'm just assuming here that you're a fairly inexperienced developer who has never really, well, you haven't lived a full. I'm just guessing now that you're on the younger side, because no older person I've ever talked to has the idea that, you know what, I'm just gonna make my entire life about this thing here. I'm gonna focus on that thing, and that's the way it's gonna stay until my golden years. You might feel that way now. You might want to be specialized on one thing right now, but odds are that before your life is over, you're going to change your mind at some point or want to try something out. And that's where backend development definitely helps you out, because it gives you the best foundation of all the niches. And I mean, I'm just talking about the three most common ones, and there are other niches that you could go into, but this is definitely a good starting point. And then let's talk about DevOps, or operations, which is also a pretty good niche to look into, at least these days, because everybody is desperately trying to find someone who's good in this space. I will say to you that this is a little bit, the line between a backend developer and a DevOps person or an operations person is a little bit funky. Like, it's a little bit blurry for me, and I think for most of the industry. But in this role, you will most primarily be focusing on operations type of work, cloud solutions and infrastructure and things of this nature. The reason why I think that this is also a very good niche for you is because it's high value. It's really high value. Even though, say, there's a larger request, like the demand for front-end developers and especially back-end developers is usually higher than for DevOps and operations personnel, the value of what you can provide if you're good at this stuff is enormous. In many cases, you will find yourself being paid more than most application developers or backend developers and front-end developers, simply because the work that you do requires a very high level of expertise, and the responsibilities of the role is fairly high profile. Is fairly high. It is also one of the probably one of the more stimulating roles that you can have, because you're basically involved in the lowest level of the company. Like, if the work that you do affects everybody, and you're going to learn quite a lot about how to run an effective company through just working in that space. The learning potentially as an operations or DevOps person is absolutely enormous. And here you can, as I said, also very easily transition from this role to another role, because you're going to get fairly hardcore engineering skills. Something to be a little bit mindful within this space, though, is that it is probably the gutters of the stack. Every single problem for whatever reason that might come your way is going to be your responsibility. The operations people are probably the developers who get the least amount of sleep in IT, because any outage, any issues with production, any unperformant code or bugs or anything like that is going to go through you most of the time. I know that you probably watched a few tech talks from Google, and they say that they have figured this out, and that then there are a few other companies who said that they've figured this out as well. And for the vast majority of companies, that's just not how the world looks. For the vast majority of companies that you're going to find yourself doing operations work in, it is a spider web of scripts and semi-working systems and blissfully ignored bugs and warnings and false positives and etc. etc. There's all kinds of nuances to the role, and most of the time you're going to find yourself in constant support mode, like you're basically just putting out fires every single day of the week. And it is definitely one of the roles where, well, I don't want to dissuade you from it, because their work is extremely stimulating if you find this sort of stuff interesting, but you should be aware of that it requires a lot from you, and in many cases the amount of time you get to spend working overtime stands in direct proportion, not just to how well you do work, but how the company is managed. If you have a company that is really shitty at making good technical decisions, you're going to have to weigh up that. You're the lowest level that just holds everything up. And if nobody really is investing in that foundation, you're the one who's just going to have to stand there like Atlas and just hold on as much as you can until the whole thing collapses. And then it's still going to be your fault. So what I want you to take away from this is that if you don't want to be a full stack developer, don't worry, you don't have to be a full stack developer. And I'm just going to give you the three normal things that you can niche yourself in. It's going to be front end, which is the good parts about front end is usually that there's a lot of learning materials. There's a lot of popularity in front end today. It's a very good space. A lot of stuff is happening. Bad parts is that your tech skills are going to be a little bit less than the other roles, because most of what front end is focused on is tooling these days and design and so forth, which is a good thing, but it's something to be aware of. The good thing about being a backend developer is that it probably is the most mainstream thing that you can be in terms of in IT. Everybody is looking for backend developers, and practically nothing is in higher demand than backend developers. Bad thing about it is, I suppose, well, yeah, you can't really do much without, like, you need, it's very hard for you to survive completely like as a backend developer without learning some front end stuff and some operation stuff, unless you're working companies that really do have everybody that you could possibly need for all your needs. Backend developers are usually, I'm not saying they're full stack developers, but they kind of have to be a little bit of everything in order to make things work. And they have to face the same sort of problems as the other roles in many cases. And then the DevOps engineers, they are probably the highest value roles that you can look for. They're not as popular, like they're not as in high demand as the backend developers, but they can get quite hefty salaries. On the other hand, it's also worth knowing that they have to deal with a lot of shit on average. It's a role where definitely you need to understand that if you're in the wrong company, you might not get to spend all that much time outside of work, simply because you're always putting out fires. Have a great day.